Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends, thank you for joining me for another quick video talking about 4 different types of whiskey. They are all whiskies. In fact, they're also all from Scotland. So they're all Scotch whiskies, but they're 4 very different types of Scotch whisky. So I want to talk a little bit about the differences between them, what they mean, what the terms are, and what to expect between those differences. So first we're going to start with blended whiskey, which is a Johnnie Walker Black Label, and in an old box, but hasn't changed too much over the years. A Johnnie Walker Green Label, which is a blended malt. So we've gone from blended whiskey to blended malt. A Balvenie 12 Double Wood, which is a single malt whiskey. And then a member favourite from a couple of years ago now, 29.248 Creaking Ships Lost in the Fog, which is a single cask single malt whiskey. So I want to talk a little bit briefly about each 4 of these. I'm going to start with blended whiskey. Blended whiskey is the backbone of the whiskey trade. It's what keeps the distilleries going. It's what sells the most around the world. Last time I checked, something like 92% of all whiskey sold around the world is blended whiskey. For good reason. It's consistent, it's affordable, and you can see it everywhere. And they've also got huge brands behind it like Johnnie Walker, Chivas Regal, Ballantine's, those kind of things. What blended whiskey is a combination of malt whiskey and grain whiskey from a range of distilleries, usually from 2 or more distilleries. In some cases it might be 30 different distilleries, it might be 3 different distilleries. In rare cases it might even be 1 distillery making their own blended whiskey, but I won't go into that just now. In Johnnie Walker's case, they own about 1/3 of the distilleries in Scotland, so they have a huge access to distillery stockpiles of grain and malt whiskey. Usually speaking, not always, but a lot of the time, the dearer the blended whiskey is, the higher the malt component, malted barley component is, and sometimes the cheaper ones have a higher grain component. Grain whiskey is often seen as a bit of a cheaper alternative to malt whiskey, but it doesn't have to necessarily be. It's often just as tasty, and I think it deserves its own place in the sun. But I won't go down that avenue too far, but that is blended whiskey. You can expect a consistent, clean, and approachable style right there. Moving on from that, of course, is blended malt. Now, I talked about a little bit about this with another video coming out shortly on Clementine Confit, our March blended malt. This is Johnnie Walker Green Label. It says on the front label, blended malt Scotch whisky. So no grain in the blended malt, just malt whiskey component, which means it's a bit dearer than most blended whiskies. Last time I checked, Green Label runs about $90 or $100 or something like that. And it's a 15-year-old in this case, naturally intense with a distinct smokiness and a big malty heart. Oh. So this is a blended malt. And it makes for, I guess, often blended malts come across as a bit sort of creamier, a bit fuller on the mouth texture, and all around quite rounded in profile. I'm always genuinely surprised that blended malts aren't more popular. There's a few ones out there like Chivas Altus, Monkey Shoulder, Green Label, but of course we do occasionally make some heresy bottlings at the Society, which are outside of our single cask approach, and our whiskey maker Ewan Campbell gets to really play around with some really custom casks and spirit types, which you can read on the back of Clementine Confit another time. Then you've got single malt whiskey. What that means is it could be a multitude of different barley types. It could be a multitude of different aged casks, minimum 12 years in this case and older. And it's all from 1 distillery. It doesn't mean it's 1 barley type or 1 distillation run or 1 cask. It just means it's 100% malted barley made to create the spirit from 1 distillery. Now in this case it's a double wood, so it's matured in 2 distinct casks. They're not trying to tell you it's a single cask, which is good. And it's aged 12 years, 40% ABV, means it's a minimum of 12 years age, and it's a mixture of casks, in this case ex-bourbon and ex-sherry oak, to mature that spirit. All from 1 distillery. Single malt whiskey means it's 100% malted barley from 1 distillery. In terms of flavour, that usually means you get a distinct distillery character, a distillate character if you like. That's why people often say, oh, I prefer the Balvenie, or I like Glenfiddich, or I like Yamazaki, whatever the distillery is, because they identify with that distillery profile as opposed to a blend, which is great. And so there's usually a bit more transparency with these about the cask types and things used. Sometimes, in this case it is, not always, unfortunately. And then of course what we do at the Society, what we do best at the Society, and what we focus in on most of the time, is single cask, single malt whiskey. I've picked one out from a few years ago, this lovely Black Label 29.248, that's Distillery 29 and the 248th cask ever bottled by the Society. This particular bottling, I remember, was an absolute hit at the Oak Barrel Whiskey Fair back in, I'm going to say 2018 or 17, 2018, I think it was about right. Stunning bottling. Anyway, this was a 21-year-old single cask, single malt whiskey from one distillery, but one cask. So this only yielded 256 bottles for the whole world, and we offered it just to our membership of 30,000 members. So you can imagine these are pretty desirable. This is very much on the pointy end of whiskey appreciation and enjoyment, but of course that's for very distinct different types of Scotch whisky, and that's not even going into Irish or bourbon or whatever. This is just 4 different types of Scotch whisky in different ways that they're presented. I hope you've learned something along the way, just a bit of a background on 4 different types of whisky that you can enjoy and you can discover, and I hope to see you in our next video soon. Cheers!